Everyone saw the sign nailed to my gate: violation, unpaid fees, but no one asked why. I had built that mountain estate with my own hands, poured every ounce of sweat and late-night energy into shaping it. The stone walls glimmered in the sun like a fortress carved out of ambition, the pine-scented air wrapped around every corner. And yet here it was, a thin piece of paper mocking everything I had fought for. I remember the first knock at my door, sharp and unexpected, breaking the calm hum of the morning. When I opened it, the HOA representative stood there, clipboard in hand, eyes cold, voice sharper than the winter wind outside. "You are behind on your dues," he said, like a judge reading a sentence. "If payment isn't made, we will proceed with lien enforcement." I stared at him, incredulous. "Lien enforcement on my home?" I barely recognized my own voice. It trembled with disbelief. The community I had chosen for its serenity suddenly felt like a cage. Everyone I had waved to at neighborhood gatherings, everyone I had smiled at on quiet trails, now seemed like spectators in a play where I had no lines. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a target. And the more I tried to explain, the more it felt like I was shouting into a canyon, my words swallowed by echoes of bureaucracy and indifference. At night, I would sit on the balcony, staring at the mountains that had always been my sanctuary, tracing the jagged ridges with my eyes and wondering how it could all be taken away over numbers on a page. I thought about the long nights I had spent calculating every expense, every repair, every minor upgrade, thinking it was enough to secure my place here. Apparently it was. The HOA didn't see the nights, the sweat, the passion. They only saw a number on a spreadsheet, a delinquent account. Then came the first letter with the threat spelled out in ink thick and uncompromising. "Immediate action required. Failure to comply will result in property seizure." I held it in my hands like a bomb ticking silently against my chest. I could feel the pulse of anger, fear, and disbelief all at once. My family tried to comfort me, but comfort felt like a fragile paper umbrella against a storm that was already tearing through the estate I had built. I knew I had to respond. I couldn't just pay, not because I didn't have the money, but because I couldn't stand by while a faceless organization reduced my life to a bill. There was a fire inside me, quiet, burning, demanding not just restitution, but acknowledgement. I began documenting everything, every payment I had made, every conversation, every date, every signature. The piles of paperwork grew like a second home, stacks reaching the ceilings, the air thick with the scent of ink and paper, proof of a life meticulously lived and meticulously dismissed. But proof doesn't always equate to justice. And the more I fought, the more the HOA escalated. Letters became threats. Threats became legal notices, and in their cold efficiency they didn't see the human cost, the sleepless nights, the anxiety that settled like dust in every room. I remember packing the marble floors of my living room, staring at the fireplace, wondering if I had made a mistake by ever believing that fairness existed in these suburban corridors of power. The first crack came when they sent a team to assess my property, cameras in hand, scanning walls, porches, gardens. It felt like an invasion, a silent accusation written into the lens. I followed them at a distance, heart pounding, stomach tight. Every corner they inspected felt like a betrayal, every shadow they photographed like a personal indictment. And in that moment I realized this wasn't about fees, it was about control. About proving that no matter what you had built, they could dismantle it if you didn't conform. I stepped back, taking a deep breath, letting the cold mountain air fill my lungs. For a moment I felt small, crushed by the weight of injustice. But then, as I looked out over the valley below, over the forest that had been my refuge, over the very land that had watched me grow, I felt a shift. A whisper at the edge of fear, a seed of determination. They thought they could intimidate me. They thought they could erase years of my life with a signature and a stamp. They were wrong. And that was when the plan began to form, slow, careful, deliberate. Not a plan of destruction at first, but a plan of understanding, of preparation. I had to see every move they made, anticipate every legal trap, every procedural step. Because if I was going to fight back, it wouldn't just be for me. It would be for the principle that no one should ever feel helpless in the place they call home. The mountains were quiet that night, but inside me, everything was roaring. The story had begun, not with anger, but with disbelief. And now, disbelief was evolving into resolve. Whatever came next, I knew I would not let this chapter of my life end with my hands tied and my home taken. The next morning, the mountains seemed colder, sharper, as if they had sensed the storm that was brewing. I woke before sunrise, heart pounding, mind spinning with every letter, every notice, every silent threat that had come to define my days. My coffee grew cold in the kitchen, untouched, while I stared at the sunrise bleeding over the ridges. How could a system designed to protect a community turn into a weapon against one of its own? The first meeting with the HOA board was scheduled for noon, but I arrived early. I wanted to see their faces to measure the people who had decided I was expendable. I walked the corridors of the community center, polished wood and fluorescent lights casting sterile shadows. Their voices echoed faintly in the hallways, clipped, rehearsed, almost mechanical. I waited outside the conference room, listening to the laughter, the casual greetings, the sense of entitlement that filled the air. It wasn't just bureaucracy. It was arrogance wrapped in paper and signatures. When I was finally called in, the room felt smaller than I had imagined. The board members sat like judges on a bench, expressions unreadable, pens poised over sheets of paper. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, trying to steady the trembling in my hands. "I've reviewed my account," I began, keeping my voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I believe there's been a mistake." One of them, a man with a crisp suit and sharper eyes, leaned forward. "Mistake? Our records are clear. Payments overdue. Lien enforcement pending." His words landed like blows. I opened my mouth to argue, to explain, but the chorus of papers shuffling and eyes scanning made it clear. They weren't listening. They weren't here to hear me. They were here to confirm their own narrative. I left the meeting with the same cold letter in my hands, the same feeling of invisibility pressing down on me. I walked back to the estate, each step heavier than the last. The mountains outside seemed indifferent, their peaks piercing the sky without concern for my struggles. And yet, as I approached my gate, I noticed something I hadn't before. The way the wind stirred the trees, the sunlight glinting off the roof tiles, the subtle resilience of the land itself. It was a reminder that life endured, even when systems failed, even when justice seemed absent. I spent the following days in a haze of research and quiet anger. I read every clause of the HOA bylaws, every state statute, every loophole I could find. I created charts, timelines, and folders full of evidence. I interviewed neighbors discreetly, gauging who might stand with me and who would remain silent. And slowly, meticulously, a plan began to take shape, not born of vengeance, but of necessity. I realized that if I was going to survive this, if I was going to protect what I had built, I would need to understand their world better than they did. At night, I would sit in the study, tracing my finger along maps of the district, visualizing every property line, every access road, every gate. It was obsessive, yes, but it was also empowering. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of control. The HOA had underestimated me. They didn't know that I could see the patterns beneath their polished surface. They didn't know that I had patience, persistence, and a sense of purpose that couldn't be measured in fees or signatures. Then came the whispers from neighbors, casual comments over hedges, cautious remarks about other homeowners who had suffered similar fates. "They don't care who you are," one neighbor said quietly. "They just want control." Another shook her head, eyes distant. "I tried to fight them once. You can't. You'll just be drained." Their words should have scared me, but instead they fueled something deeper. Fear turned into resolve. Isolation became a sharpened focus. And in that quiet, private war room of my own making, I understood something profound. They were powerful, yes, but I was relentless. I began documenting every interaction, every correspondence, every surveillance notice they sent. Photos, emails, certified letters, a growing archive that felt almost alive, a record of both their power and their vulnerability. Every action they took, every bureaucratic move was a thread I could follow, a pattern I could exploit. It was a game of patience, and I was determined to master it. Late one night, as the moon rose over the pine forests, I stood at the balcony again, looking down at the lights of the valley below. I thought about how small they must have felt, insulated in their offices and boardrooms, oblivious to the human life they were disrupting. And a quiet, almost imperceptible smile formed on my lips, not of malice, but of clarity. I had found the opening, the point where their armor was weakest. I just had to wait, just had to prepare. Sometimes the strongest moves are invisible. Sometimes the fiercest resistance is silent. I had learned that in the solitude of my mountains, in the shadows of a system designed to crush me, And as I turned back inside, the first seeds of strategy fully planted, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Hope sharp and purposeful, like the edge of a blade. Why did it feel like the walls of my own home were closing in? I could hear the faint hum of the valley below, the soft rustle of the pines outside, and yet inside my thoughts were a storm. Every letter from the HOA, every phone call, every official notice replayed in my mind like a relentless drumbeat. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they could suffocate me with rules, penalties, and intimidation. But they didn't see the quiet storm gathering within me. The first decisive move came on a Thursday. I had spent weeks mapping their schedules, their meeting patterns, even the routes their inspectors took to assess properties. It was obsessive, yes, but in obsession there is clarity. I wasn't acting out of vengeance yet, not fully. This was reconnaissance preparation, understanding the terrain before the battle. I drove through the community at dusk, the headlights tracing shadows across manicured lawns, my notebook balanced on the passenger seat. Each street, each gate, each HOA official's routine was a puzzle piece, and for the first time the picture was beginning to take shape. At home, I began building my arsenal of evidence. Photographs of every inspection, recordings of every conversation, copies of every payment and receipt meticulously logged. By now, the stacks of paper had grown into towers, threatening to topple onto the polished floors of my study, and yet there was satisfaction in it, a sense that I was reclaiming power inch by inch. The HOA had underestimated me. They didn't know I was relentless. They didn't know that patience and precision could be just as potent as anger. But it wasn't just strategy, it was also isolation. People began to pull away. Friends whispered, neighbors averted their gaze. "Don't get involved," they said. "It's a losing battle." That isolation could have been crippling. For a moment I felt it. The weight of being alone against a faceless authority. The ache of knowing that the system was designed to crush anyone who dared resist. But then, looking at the mountains through my window, I remembered why I had built this home, why I had climbed every ridge and carved every corner with my own hands. It wasn't for approval. It was for dignity. And dignity refuses to bow. One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, casting long shadows across my estate, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. A pattern. Every inspection, every legal notice, every move the HOA made had a timing, a rhythm. If I could anticipate that rhythm, I could position myself not just to defend, but to counter. I realized then that the fight wasn't about confrontation, it was about intelligence. It was about seeing the game they thought they controlled and quietly rewriting the rules. I began reaching out discreetly to allies. Not loud declarations, not cries for attention, but subtle connections, neighbors who had experienced similar harassment, local attorneys curious about HOA overreach, former board members with grudges of their own. Each conversation was a thread, and together they formed a web of insight, of potential leverage. I wasn't alone anymore, not entirely. Even in the shadow of fear, I found quiet solidarity. And then came the first taste of escalation. A new notice arrived, this one bold, almost brazen. Final notice, legal action imminent. I read it over and over, each word a hammer striking against my resolve, but instead of crushing me, it crystallized my purpose. I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, a controlled heat that sharpened my focus. I would not react impulsively. I would not give them the satisfaction of fear. I would act with precision. Night after night I planned. I cross-referenced every HOA regulation, every loophole, every historical precedent. I created timelines and scenario maps. I even anticipated the emotional manipulation, the guilt they would try to impose, the quiet intimidation tactics meant to make me doubt myself. Every potential move they could make, I accounted for. It was exhausting, meticulous, and terrifying. And yet, with every new layer of understanding, the fear began to fade, replaced by something sharper: clarity. Sometimes the smallest victories are invisible. When I spotted a procedural error in one of their filings, something a careless clerk had overlooked, I felt it immediately deep in my chest. It was like finding a crack in the armor of a seemingly invincible opponent. The realization hit me with the force of a mountain storm. They were not infallible. They were human. They could be challenged. And once that truth settled in, my strategy began to take on a dangerous elegance, a rhythm all its own. By the time the moon rose high over the estate, the quiet mountain night seemed almost electric. I stood on the balcony, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the lights of the valley below. Every detail mattered. Every shadow, every movement, every routine. I was no longer just a homeowner under siege. I was a tactician, quietly preparing to reclaim what had been taken. And in that silence, I realized something profound. The fight wasn't just about property. It was about being seen, about being acknowledged, about proving that no matter how faceless the opposition, determination could bend the course of events. The battle had begun, though no one yet realized it. And I knew deep down that the coming days would test everything, my patience, my resolve, even my sense of morality. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel powerless. I felt alive. Alive and ready. Why did the calm of the mountains feel so deceiving? I could hear the faint rustle of the pines outside, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, and yet inside, every nerve in my body was on edge. The HOA had sent yet another notice, this one thicker, heavier, almost threatening in its formality. Immediate action required, it read with language designed to unsettle. But I no longer flinched. I had waited. I had prepared. And now it was time to act. The first confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream in a boardroom or a dramatic scene in front of neighbors. It was subtle, precise, like the first strike of a carefully aimed arrow. I had discovered an irregularity in their own filing, a missed signature, a procedural error so fundamental that it undermined their authority entirely. My heart pounded as I realized what this meant. The system they thought invincible was flawed, vulnerable. I could feel the surge of satisfaction, but I kept it controlled. Patience had taught me that restraint was more powerful than anger. I scheduled a formal meeting, armed with every piece of evidence I had accumulated. Stacks of receipts, logs of every communication, photographs, recordings, proof that I had paid my dues and followed every rule to the letter. As I approached the community center, the familiar sense of dread tried to creep in. But this time it faltered. I had rehearsed every point, anticipated every objection. The fear that once gnawed at my chest was now a tool, sharpened into focus. The board members looked at me with a mix of curiosity and dismissal as I entered. Their air of superiority was intact, but I noticed the subtle cracks, a glance that lingered too long, a hand that twitched over a pen, an uneasy shift in posture. I laid out my evidence calmly, methodically, letting each piece speak for itself. Every misstep they had made was exposed. Every assumption they had relied upon was dismantled quietly, one fact at a time. I felt a thrill I hadn't expected, not of malice, but of vindication. When they tried to interrupt, I held up my hand, signaling that I would not be swayed by theatrics or intimidation. "Please," I said, voice steady, "let the facts speak first." And they did. Receipts, signatures, documented timelines, a mountain of proof that made the room feel smaller, oppressive even, as the weight of their own oversight settled over them. I could see it in their eyes, disbelief, irritation, a faint hint of panic. For the first time, I realized that I had shifted the balance. They had underestimated me, and that was their mistake. After the meeting, I returned to the estate, heart racing but steady. The mountains seemed to hold their breath with me, silent witnesses to the turning tide. I knew this was just the beginning. The HOA would regroup, reassess, perhaps even retaliate. But I had shown them that I was not powerless. I had shown them that the rules, when examined closely and wielded wisely, could be a shield as strong as any fortress. In the following days, the tension in the community became almost tangible. Neighbors who had avoided me now glanced my way with curiosity, some with quiet admiration. The whispers that had once warned me of inevitable defeat now carried hints of possibility. I felt the isolation I had endured slowly eroding, replaced by a subtle solidarity. The battle was no longer mine alone. It had become a quiet statement to the community. Even the seemingly untouchable can be challenged. Yet victory was still far from certain. The HOA was formidable, their bureaucracy vast and impersonal, their network of allies quietly intimidating. Every letter, every communication from them became a chess piece, every move calculated to test my resolve. I realized then that winning this was not about brute force, but about endurance, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate. They believed in the inevitability of compliance. I believed in the inevitability of resistance. Late one night, as snow began to dust the peaks and the valley below glittered with lights, I stood on the balcony and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The fear that had once consumed me was now tempered by clarity. The rage that had once threatened to spiral into chaos was now disciplined into strategy. And in that quiet, solitary moment, I understood something profound. The fight was bigger than a home, bigger than fees, bigger than the HOA. It was about reclaiming agency in a world that often tried to strip it away. And then came the realization that would shape the next phase of my struggle. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. This was about exposure. If I could show the flaws, the overreach, the bureaucracy run amok, I could not only protect myself but also challenge a system that had quietly intimidated countless others. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, excitement, fear, and determination all at once. The mountains outside seemed to echo my resolve, the pine-scented air sharp and invigorating. I had turned the first corner in this battle, but I knew the path ahead would demand everything: patience, cunning, and courage. Whatever came next, I was ready, not just to defend what was mine, but to reshape the rules of the game entirely. And somewhere, deep in the valley below, the HOA remained unaware that the tide had already begun to turn. Why did it feel like the mountains themselves were holding their breath? The air was crisp, almost electric, as if the universe knew that something had shifted. I had won the first skirmish with the HOA, but the real war was just beginning. They had underestimated me once, and they would not underestimate me again, not if I could help it. The next step required subtlety, patience, and precision. I had learned that overt aggression would only feed their bureaucracy, their legal muscle. So I began to move quietly, invisibly, like a shadow weaving through the cracks of a system that thought itself untouchable. Every document I discovered, every procedural loophole I unearthed, became a weapon of information. I wasn't destroying them yet, I was preparing the battlefield. I began reaching deeper into the community, not with confrontation but with observation. I spoke to neighbors under the guise of casual conversation, asking questions about past assessments, about how fees were calculated, about the little inconsistencies that nobody dared to challenge. Their hesitance was palpable. They were afraid. Afraid of retaliation, afraid of being targeted, afraid of the machinery I had now begun to see for what it really was. And that fear, I realized, was a weapon I could not wield lightly. But I could understand it, learn from it, anticipate it. At night, I would pore over maps of the district, plotting every property, every boundary, every gate. I traced patterns of inspections, memorized schedules, and noted the peculiarities of each board member's habits. It was obsessive, yes, but obsession had a clarity all its own. With every line drawn, every note jotted in the margins, I began to see the rhythm of the HOA's operations. And once the rhythm was clear, I could begin to disrupt it. The first subtle disruption was almost imperceptible. A small filing error here, a procedural reminder there, carefully documented, carefully timed. I made sure every action was recorded so that when the time came I could present a case not just of injustice, but of incompetence. It was meticulous work, the kind of quiet diligence that nobody saw, but the effects would ripple outward like stones dropped into a still lake. But with strategy came tension. The longer I stayed vigilant, the more I noticed the personal toll it took. Sleep became fragmented, meals hurried, conversations strained. I could feel the weight of being constantly alert pressing against my chest. The mountains outside remained indifferent, silent witnesses to a war that had become as much internal as it was external. Yet even in exhaustion, there was a strange exhilaration. I was no longer a passive victim. I was an active player in a high-stakes game. One evening, I received a call that made my blood run cold. A new board member had been appointed, someone rumored to be ruthless, unyielding, and deeply loyal to the existing leadership. The timing was deliberate, I knew. It was meant to intimidate, to remind me that the system could adapt, that my victories so far were temporary. I listened quietly, heart hammering, and then hung up. Fear flickered, but it was tempered by resolve. They were testing me, and I would not flinch. The next day, I began drafting letters, carefully worded, citing every precedent I had discovered, every procedural misstep, every irregularity in their filings. Each sentence was deliberate, each paragraph a step in a dance I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't threatening. I was asserting authority with facts, with logic, with undeniable evidence. It was a quiet kind of power, the kind that unsettled even the most confident bureaucrats. And yet, even as I strengthened my position, I couldn't escape the emotional currents beneath it all. The anger that had first fueled me had evolved into something more complex, a deep, simmering pride, an understanding of my own resilience. I thought about the nights spent packing the halls, the hours spent compiling evidence, the isolation and fear, and realized that every hardship had honed me, sharpened me. I was no longer the homeowner they thought they could intimidate. I was a force quietly gathering momentum, invisible but unstoppable. By the time the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the valley in fiery hues of red and gold, I stood on the balcony once again, notebook in hand. The battle was no longer abstract. It was real, tangible, a living, breathing entity that required every ounce of my attention, every drop of strategy, every ounce of courage. The HOA had set the stage, but I was no longer a player. I was shaping the game itself. And in that moment, as the wind whipped through the pine trees and the last light of day kissed the stone walls of my estate, I knew this. The fight had only just begun. But I would not yield, not to fear, not to bureaucracy, not to power cloaked in authority. Whatever came next, I was ready. The mountains had taught me patience, resilience, and strategy, and now it was time to strike with precision. Why did the quiet of the mountains feel like it was holding a secret? I could hear the faint rustle of pine needles outside, the soft hum of distant traffic in the valley, and yet inside, everything was alive with anticipation. I had spent weeks preparing, mapping, planning, observing, and now the first moves in my quiet revolution were ready to unfold. The morning started like any other, but I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, a taut wire of excitement and fear. I double-checked my files, ensuring that every piece of evidence was in order. Receipts, photographs, timelines, correspondence meticulously arranged. I wasn't just ready, I was armed with clarity and precision. Every document was a shield, every detail a sword, and every step I would take from here on would be deliberate. I began with subtle, almost imperceptible actions. Notices sent with precision, responses to procedural missteps, inquiries that exposed inconsistencies. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, yet the ripple effect was immediate. Within days, I could sense the unease in the community office, subtle changes in tone during phone calls, hesitation in emails, a small tremor of uncertainty that had never been there before. They were noticing, just enough to be unsettled, and I thrived in that subtle shift. But with strategy came the weight of awareness. Every action had consequences, every move could provoke retaliation. I had to be careful, calculating, and always a step ahead. Late nights were spent not in anger, but in focus. I pored over their procedural manuals, cross-referenced regulations, and built scenarios in my mind, each one anticipating their next move. The hours stretched, the isolation deepened, but my resolve. I was no longer reacting. I was dictating the pace of this confrontation. The first real test arrived unexpectedly. One of the inspectors, the same person who had photographed every corner of my property weeks ago, arrived at my gate without notice. A flicker of panic rose, old instincts, old fear, but I didn't falter. I had anticipated this. I welcomed him politely, documented his visit, asked precise questions about his observations, all while keeping a calm exterior. Every word, every gesture was intentional. By the time he left, I had gathered information that would strengthen my position in ways he could never have imagined. That night, I reviewed the day's encounters in my study, the stacks of papers surrounding me like walls in a fortress. Each interaction, each subtle maneuver was a puzzle piece. I could see the pattern forming. The HOA was reacting, often without realizing why. Their power was built on routine, on predictability, and now I had begun to disrupt that rhythm. I felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Then came the whispers from neighbors. Carefully veiled questions, subtle acknowledgments of my efforts, hints that they had begun to notice the cracks in the HOA's armor. It was quiet but meaningful. People who had once turned away now lingered in conversation, sharing stories of their own frustrations, asking questions about procedure, about rights, about the audacity to challenge a system they had long believed untouchable. I listened, absorbed, and allowed the network of subtle support to form without revealing my full hand. And yet, even as progress unfolded, the emotional toll was undeniable. There were nights I couldn't sleep, mornings I woke with a heaviness in my chest, moments when the isolation pressed so hard it felt suffocating. But within that struggle, there was also revelation. Courage isn't always loud, and resistance isn't always visible. Sometimes it lives in quiet determination, in meticulous preparation, in the patience to wait for the precise moment to act. By the time the moon rose over the peaks, painting the estate in silver light, I had laid the foundation for what would come next. The HOA was beginning to stumble, unaware that their routines, their assumptions, and their sense of control were being dismantled methodically. I was no longer simply defending my home. I was shaping the narrative, controlling the battlefield, preparing for the moment when subtlety would become undeniable force. And in that quiet, the mountains themselves seemed to hum with anticipation. They had witnessed my journey from fear to resolve, from anger to strategy, and now stood as silent allies to the path I had chosen. I realized then that the fight wasn't merely about unpaid fees or bureaucratic overreach. It was about visibility, about agency, about proving that even in a world designed to diminish you, careful, deliberate action could reclaim both dignity and power. The first moves were complete. The next phase, decisive, unrelenting, unavoidable, was on the horizon. And as I gazed out over the valley below, the lights of neighboring homes twinkling innocently in the night, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I was no longer a passive victim. I was a force quietly gathering momentum, poised for the moment when the HOA would finally realize that the mountains could not be tamed, and neither could I. Why did the walls of my home suddenly feel so alive? I could hear the wind rattling the windows, the pine needles scraping against the stone paths outside, and yet inside everything pulsed with anticipation. The first wave of subtle disruptions had worked. The HOA was off balance, stumbling in ways I had carefully orchestrated. But I knew this was the moment when hesitation could be fatal. The stakes were higher now, personal, almost intimate, and the game was no longer about bureaucracy. It was about survival, dignity, and the quiet reclamation of power. I began to escalate, but not recklessly. Every move was calculated, like a chess player nudging pieces into position long before the checkmate. I filed challenges to their assessments, citing procedural errors that no one had dared to confront. I requested formal reviews of their inspections, highlighting inconsistencies that forced them to pause, to reconsider, to acknowledge that perhaps they were not infallible. Each response I received carried a subtle tremor, a crack in their armor that I could exploit. Neighbors began to notice, not in loud proclamations or public support, but in small gestures, doors held open, casual remarks about noticing discrepancies in HOA behavior, cautious questions about my success. It was enough to know that the ripples of my efforts were spreading, quietly but unmistakably. And with that, I realized something profound. Resistance can inspire even when it is invisible. Courage is contagious even when spoken in whispers. Yet even as victories accumulated, the emotional toll deepened. Some nights I would sit alone in the study, surrounded by towers of paper, and feel the weight of exhaustion pressing into my chest. The solitude was oppressive at times, the pressure relentless. I wondered if it was madness to continue, if the relentless grind would eventually break me. And then I would look out at the mountains, at the forests that had been my refuge, and remember why I had started this journey. For my home, yes, but also for my sense of self, my refusal to be diminished by faceless authority. The HOA, realizing that I was no longer a passive participant, began to escalate in return. Notices became more urgent, threats sharper, insinuations more pointed. It was their first real attempt to regain control, to remind me of their power, but I had anticipated this. I had anticipated fear, intimidation, and manipulation, and I met each attempt with evidence, strategy, and calculated patience. Every action they took was documented, every response meticulously crafted. I had turned their aggression into my own advantage, quietly forcing them to stumble. And then came the revelation that shifted everything. In reviewing a set of documents they had sent, I discovered not just an error but a pattern of overreach, a systemic failure that had impacted multiple homeowners, not just me. The realization hit with the force of a thunderclap. This was bigger than a single dispute. This was about exposing the cracks in a system designed to intimidate and control. The fire in my chest, already smoldering, ignited fully. I was no longer just defending my property. I was preparing to reveal a truth that could not be ignored. The first public step was subtle but deliberate. I shared carefully documented evidence with neighbors who had expressed concern, presenting facts without embellishment, letting the gravity speak for itself. The response was immediate, quiet acknowledgement, whispered validation, cautious gratitude. It was enough to know that the momentum was shifting, that the balance of fear and control was tilting in my favor. The HOA's carefully constructed image of authority was fracturing, almost imperceptibly, almost invisibly, but undeniably. Late at night, as the moonlight spilled across the stone walls of my estate, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. Fear had been a companion, but it no longer dictated my actions. Anger had driven me at first, but now strategy and clarity guided my every move. And pride, quiet, steadfast, unyielding pride, filled the spaces in between. I had transformed from a homeowner under siege into a tactician, a strategist, a quiet force whose presence alone reshaped the battlefield. And yet, as I looked out over the valley, over the neighboring homes whose lights twinkled like fragile stars, I understood that the final confrontation was still ahead. The HOA would regroup, would push back harder, would attempt to reassert control with every weapon at their disposal. But I was ready. Every piece of evidence, every ally, every carefully planned maneuver had led to this moment. I had the advantage of clarity, the momentum of subtle victories, and the knowledge that the mountains themselves had witnessed my journey from fear to resolve. This was the precipice. Everything I had built, everything I had endured, was leading to a moment when subtlety would give way to undeniable force. And as the wind stirred the pine trees and the cold mountain air filled my lungs, I felt it fully. The tide was turning. The HOA would learn in ways they could not yet imagine that some battles cannot be won by intimidation alone, and that even the mightiest authority can crumble when faced with patient, determined resistance. Why did the mountains feel impossibly still that morning? The air was sharp, almost electric, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The months of preparation, of observation, of quiet maneuvering had led to this moment. Every calculated move, every subtle disruption, every documented misstep by the HOA had been leading here. The stage was set, and I was ready. I arrived at the community center early, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with undeniable evidence and unshakable resolve. My files were organized, every fact cross-referenced, every loophole exposed, every instance of overreach documented. I could see the faces of the board members as I entered, curiosity, irritation, a flicker of unease. They had underestimated me for months, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. I laid out the case calmly, meticulously, letting the weight of truth do the work that shouting never could. Receipts, inspection photos, legal correspondence, procedural errors, a mountain of evidence that left no room for misinterpretation. Every question they asked was met with precision, every objection countered with fact. Slowly the room shifted. The smug arrogance that had filled it for so long gave way to tension, then to hesitation. And in that hesitation I found my first taste of triumph. But the victory was not mine alone. Neighbors, previously silent, began to step forward, sharing their own experiences, adding layers to the narrative I had quietly constructed. It became clear that this wasn't just about my home, my dues, my fight. This was about a system that had quietly intimidated an entire community. And as the stories intertwined, as the evidence mounted, the HOA's authority, so long assumed unassailable, began to crumble before our collective truth. Every objection they raised was met not with rage, but with clarity. Every procedural argument they attempted was dismantled by careful documentation. And as the hours wore on, it became undeniable. Their control was not absolute. Their power had limits, and we had found them. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, tempered by exhaustion. Months of preparation, nights spent in solitude, every moment of doubt and fear had brought us here. Then came the final blow, a procedural oversight so fundamental that it rendered the HOA's threats legally unenforceable. It was almost poetic, the symmetry of the struggle. The system they had relied upon to intimidate and suppress had been turned against them, with precision and patience as our instruments. The realization hit the board members like a cold wind. Faces paled, hands fumbled, and the carefully constructed veneer of authority cracked irreparably. The emotional release was profound, not in gloating, not in vengeance, but in the quiet reclamation of dignity and agency. I had not only defended my home, but had exposed the truth of a system that operated in shadows, had given voice to neighbors who had long been silenced, and had proven that determination, strategy, and patience could challenge even the most entrenched authority. The pride that swelled inside me was not loud, but it was deep, steady, and unshakable. As I stepped outside, the mountains seemed to exhale with me. The snow-capped peaks gleamed in the sunlight, the pine forests whispered their approval, and the air felt impossibly clear. I looked down at my estate, at every stone, every wall, every detail I had poured myself into, and realized that this victory was not just about bricks and mortar. It was about perseverance, about courage, about refusing to be diminished by faceless power. In the weeks that followed, the HOA retreated, their authority weakened, their ability to intimidate diminished. The community, once quiet and compliant, began to speak. Conversations about fairness, accountability, and transparency emerged in casual gatherings, in whispered conversations along hedges, in cautious but growing solidarity. The impact of a single, determined voice had rippled outward, transforming fear into empowerment. And yet, even as the victory settled, there was a quiet lesson lingering in the mountain air. True strength is not always visible. True courage is often silent. Sometimes the most profound change comes not from confrontation alone, but from preparation, patience, and an unshakable belief in one's own agency. I had learned that the hard way, through isolation, through fear, through meticulous, unwavering resolve. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, I stood on the balcony and let the wind wash over me. The estate, the mountains, the forests, even the valley below seemed to hum with life, with possibility, with quiet triumph. I had faced a system designed to control, to intimidate, to erase the individual. And I had prevailed not with anger but with strategy, not with force but with clarity, not with vengeance but with persistence. The mountains remained still, eternal witnesses to the journey from fear to resolve, from invisibility to recognition, from despair to triumph. And in their silence I understood something essential. Some battles define not only what we defend but who we are. I had defended my home. I had defended my dignity, and I had learned that no system, no matter how rigid, no matter how intimidating, could withstand the steady, deliberate power of a determined heart. The fight was over, but the lesson and the quiet pride would endure forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.